Hi all, ACDodd here again, and following on from the success of last week's video on the top 12 faults with SU carburetors, I thought I would go one further and do a top 12 on the ignition system. So let's dig in. Okay, so if you're still watching, this is the top 12 faults I find when I'm on the road tuning with ignition systems with typically classic A series powered vehicles. Although not always, but generally that's the vehicles I get called out to. Without further ado, let's start at number 12. And number 12 is everything's wrong. So what that basically means is it's all the wrong parts, or it's not working, or it's all in poor condition. Poor condition. So what I would do in these situations is I just replace everything. So that's a new coil of the correct specification, new HT leads, new distributor, sometimes a ballast bypass wire, definitely spark plugs, obviously of the right spec, and then obviously move on to the tune. So yeah, the reason why it's at the bottom of this is because I don't have to do it a lot, but it has been known. So moving on, number 11, we come with the condenser. So it's either the wrong one, or it's not working, or it's faulty. Condensers for classic minis, certainly the classic Lucas series distributors, Lucas 25D, 45D and 59D dizzies have been an issue in the recent past. If you're using the cheap ones that cost about £3 or £4, you're on a hiding to nothing. So you need to change up to the ones that are around £10 or £11, or even the super condensers that you get from places like MED or SwiftTune Racing, because these are a lot more reliable, and often you don't need to change them every time that you change the points and things like that. I often come out to cars that have poor running or misfires, and it's due to a cheap condenser being fitted and not the more expensive ones. So the ones I carry with me when I'm tuning are the ones that are made by Distributor Doctor, and they are sold via mini spares, and so far I've had 100% success with those. Okay, so moving on. Number 11 on the countdown list is coil resistance. So this is where people have fitted new parts to their cars, or they've modified their cars or their ignition system, and unfortunately they've fitted the wrong coil, and in some sad cases they've actually taken the right coil off and they've fitted a 3 ohm coil and gone backwards. So what you have to remember is, if you're fitting a 3 ohm coil, it's a 1960s ignition system. If you're fitting a 1.5 ohm coil, that's a mid-70s to sort of early 80s ignition system, a little bit more power. And then if you're fitting a 0.8 ohm coil, then you'll go operating from mid-80s up through to the mid-90s. Okay, so the lower the ohm the coil, the more power you have in the ignition spark, and the easier it is to light off a lean mix, which is great for part throttle running. It's also good for burning off all the hydrocarbons if you're trying to run a lean mix and you're having lean misfire. So big issues there. I come out to a lot of people, they've spent their money, they've bought a new coil and they bought the wrong one. They've either been sold the wrong one, or they've got no idea what they should be fitting. So I then obviously replace it with the type that they need. In some cases, the customers ask me to change it to the high power one. So they might have a Ballast system and they want to go up to a 0.8 ohm high power. That's no problem. I'll just fit the appropriate distributor with that and upgrade the whole system. So number 9 on the list. Okay, so we're moving along now. So this is the ballast bypass wire. So what that basically means is people change their ignition system and they still maintain the ballast system, which was fitted in the 80s minis and obviously Metros and cars of that ilk, and they feed the coil mistakenly with a ballast feed, and they might already have put the wrong coil on. So they might be running a 3 ohm coil with a ballast resistor, which is 4 times less power. Ridiculous situation. So the thing hardly runs. So what you have to remember is when you're operating a car, and you upgrade the ignition, you need to make sure and you need to determine whether you need the ballast wire or not. So if you're using a car typically that has variable dwell on the distributor, if it's an electronic system, it may be able to run without the ballast resistor. So you need to confirm that it's powerful enough to be able to run without the ballast resistor and the high ohm coil. Okay, a lot of systems aren't, which is why I use the Power Spark, because I can run without a ballast resistor and I can use a 0.8 ohm coil, and the variable dwell feature of the module means that I don't overstimulate the coil at low RPM, and I'll get the full power at the higher RPM. So yeah, it's one of those things that people still make the mistake about. Big issues that using a system which has got a ballast resistor and you don't need it. So where it is needed is typically you run a 1.5 ohm coil on a points ignition system, and you have the ballast feed, and what that basically does is reduces the current through the coil when you're driving normally, and what happens is when the revs increase and the current drops, which happens naturally, the voltage increases because the voltage drop across that ballast resistor reduces due to the reduction in current, and the voltage increases as the current falls, so it maintains the power. So it acts just like a variable dwell system, and that's what it's for. Also has the benefit of being able to give you full power during cold start, so it gives you a nice big fat spark. So if you're contemplating any car build and you've got a points ignition, there is absolutely no point in building a system with a 3 ohm based coil. Pointless, because you are literally building an ignition system which is out of date. So if you're going to build, if you want a points ignition system, my advice to you is to build one with the ballast resistor included, and a 1.5 ohm coil. And if you want an electronic system, there is no point in going for the low power one. You go straight for a 0.8 ohm coil and a high power module in your Dizzy, and that's the way forward. Okay, so moving on to number 8 on the ignition system, and we get to advanced curve. So this is where I come out. I'm working my way through the engine. I use my strobe light and I'll measure the advanced curve in the distributor that's on the engine, and I find that usually the advanced curve is insufficient. So there's not enough advance, or it's far too slow. So what I mean by that is, say at 2000 RPM, you're only getting maybe 12 or 14 degrees of crank advance, whereas actually you need more like typically anywhere from 18 to 24, depending on the specification. So what I'm saying there is, advanced curve not being right is one of the major causes of poor performance. On the other hand, with advanced curves, we can go the other way. So we go to cars like later Mini Sprite with a carburetor that has a very, very long advance built in, something like can be up to 38 degrees of crank advance built into the distributor. So if you crank at around 10 degrees and you add 38 to it, you've got a 48 at the crank, so you can end up with a piston melting situation. So it's very important if you're setting up your engines to be able to understand and measure the advance curve. Now the good news here is I do understand that my colleague Darren over in the United States is currently working on a video which shows you how to measure an advance curve. So watch out for that one, and I'll link to it when it comes out. Of course, not having the right advance curve means poor efficiency, high fuel consumption, and just generally lackluster performance. So moving on, number 7, closely related to advance curve, and that is the timing setting. So when I come out to cars, I see cars that are far too advanced. So they've got maybe, I think the most I've seen is 70 degrees of ignition advance. Okay, and then on top of that, the advance curve dials in as well, so you have up to 90 degrees of ignition advance. Now that's so far advanced, that runs so terribly that the engine, will hardly pull the car along. And it's so far advanced, it won't develop enough cylinder pressure to kill itself. So yeah, I'm not joking. 70 degrees of ignition advance is as far as I've ever seen. I've seen a lot in the 40s. I've seen a lot in the 30s, and I've seen a lot in the 20s. All right, so you know, bear in mind that demonstrates to me that most people haven't got a clue how to set the ignition timing. On the other side of that, I've also seen timing, you know, as much as you know, 25 degrees retarded. Okay, so that's 25 degrees after top dead center where the timing's been set, and people are wondering why the exhaust manifold's glowing and things like that when you're trying to run the engine. It's because you haven't got enough ignition timing. And if you compound that, the ignition timing setting has to be set in relation to the previous point, which is the advance curve. So a different advance curve will typically mean a different static timing setting. All right, so it's something to bear in mind that they are related, and the timing setting, the optimum timing setting from an engine really needs to be measured on a rolling road so that you can dial in the exact advance angle needed to make that engine perform. And it's not just at the setting that you dial it in at, it's right the way across the rev range. Okay, moving forward, we now go to the vacuum unit. So it's quite common, always has been on classic A series applications and the Lucas sort of 25D, 45D and 59D dizzes. Vacuum units fail. Okay, so they usually fail where they don't operate and they leak air. So it causes an air leak for the carburetor, which upsets the fueling and upsets the way the engine runs. And obviously, because it's not working, it's not advancing the timing, so the engine feels flat on part throttle and your fuel consumption goes up. So yeah, very common to come out to cars that have failed vacuum units. Some of the more modern distributors that come from Far Eastern shores, the vacuum units aren't particularly reliable. So, you know, they can fail in as little as a year or 2 years. So it is something you need to think about checking often. So it should be part of your annual service to check your vacuum advance is working and giving you the advance figures that you actually need to make that work. So while we're talking about vacuum advance, it's no good having a vacuum advance that doesn't give enough advance, or indeed gives far too much advance. So that's something else to consider when you're actually looking at what your engine needs. Some engines are different, but typically you need around 45 degrees of advance around sort of 3,000 to 4,000 RPM at light cruise. That's the very lightest throttle. So you know, obviously as you open the throttle, the vacuum drops and the advance drops. So vacuum advance tuning is something that takes time. All right, so that isn't, you know, isn't something that most people get into. Okay, moving forward, HT leads, and typically the resistance is too high. So a lot of people just buy leads, put them on. So new leads can have resistance that's too high because they're poor quality or the wrong specification. And obviously leads tend to fail as they get older. Their internal resistance increases with age, so it's age related and not necessarily the miles. So to combat this, I recommend using the Power Spark leads, the 3808 specification lead, just their classic one. I think they charge about $13.95 plus postage. You can buy them off me for £15 when I'm tuning, and that will give you the optimum resistance for your classic car, and it also means that your system voltage is not too high. So what I mean by that is the higher the resistance, the higher the voltage needs to build in the coil in order to push the energy along the HT lead and obviously jump the gap in the plug. So if you have a resistor in your plug, that also adds to that problem. So I have seen cars, and if you look through the videos, we've had 100k or more of resistance between the coil and the plug. So if you have a resistor plugs, typically you've got 4 to 5k in the plug. If you've got a standard factory lead, it'll be about 4 to 5k in each lead. I like the Power Spark ones. They're about 1.5 to 2k per lead. So I run no resistors in the spark plug and have about 4k, you know, 3 to 4k between the spark plug and the coil. So I find that works very well for classic car applications. Just to add there, with HT lead resistance, if you're using more modern cars with fuel injection and things like that, the best I can suggest is stick to the recommended manufacturer's resistance, which is typically 5k or thereabouts per lead. You don't want to create excessive electrical noise, which can upset the ECU. One more thing on HT lead resistance. Obviously, there's insulation. Now, the insulation can be an issue. So if you've got a high resistance lead that pushes the line voltage up, the voltage can go up to a point where the insulation can break down, and then you start having a misfire. That also means that a high resistance lead will also force the coil to, because it's all part of the same circuit, to run that produce the higher voltage, and that means the insulation can fail in the coil as well. So it's something to bear in mind to keep those resistances in check and keep your leads changed annually. So as I say, they're not a lot of money, just change them every year, and you will always maintain a good spark, and you won't have a problem with misfire due to insulation breakdown. Okay, moving on. Number 4, points dwell. Now this is starting to get a bit old hat now, because there's less and less people having points, but a lot of people still, especially on the old classic cars, the ones they want to actually keep original, use points. And I'm seeing a lot of people that have no idea how to set the points. They have no idea what dwell angle is. So dwell angle is the time that the points are actually closed, and therefore the time expressed in degrees that the actual coil can charge with energy. All right, so what basically that means is the larger the gap you have on the points, the smaller the dwell angle. Okay, so it's very important to understand that when you set the points gap at, say, 15 thou, if you don't get it right, you're affecting the coil charge time. And if you take into account that the coil system on a typical classic car is only just enough energy to make that spark and work effectively, then it doesn't take much for somebody to not adjust the points correctly, or there's wear, and the coil charge time goes out the window and performance drops off. So I don't mean performance as in flat out performance. I mean the ability to light off lean mixtures and cruise properly and have good fuel economy and all that kind of stuff. When I say performance, I mean the whole thing in reality, in a round, sorry. So yeah, it's important that people stop using feeler blades to set points, because points where with a pit and a pile, so one end gets a hole in it and the other one gets a pit. And if you put the feeler blade in where the pit and the pile is, the pile on one of the contacts will cause the gap to be larger, and that will obviously reduce your coil charge time. So the way to do it is to set your points using a dwell meter, and I've got a couple of examples here to show you. The first one is my Innova timing light. Now everybody's seen that. Unfortunately, it's got a dented screen, so a slightly broken screen, but that's my own fault. So, that has an inbuilt dwell angle feature on it, and it enables you to get a nice dwell reading. It's also nice and stable, which is a good thing. But it's not my preferred method. The preferred method I use is an old school meter. Okay, so a lot of people have seen me use this when I'm out tuning. This is an old kit from the mid 60s, late or early 70s in the United States. So this was sold as an electronics kit, and it enabled people to buy the parts and then make the kit up. So it's no longer available, but it's an old Heathkit device, and it was known as the automotive tune-up meter. And this was designed for people in America to tune up their V8s and their older cars. And the beauty of this is it gives a lovely stable reading, so there's no flicking, it's just perfectly smooth, and it's absolutely ideal for working on your classic cars. Also has other features, so there's a low RPM and high RPM rev counter option. And it measures DC volts, so it's a standard automotive meter for classic cars. Works really well. The only problem is they're not cheap, so by the time you import these, and typically they're very old now, so they might need a few components changing to make them serviceable. This is the one that I imported from the United States, and I had to repair it and calibrate it before I used it. So again, this stuff is not available now, and it would be nice if there was a company out there, or at least maybe even a Far Eastern supplier, that could make a basic engine test meter with a decent dwell setting on it, an RPM and some voltage reading and maybe some resistance reading, all on one old school gauge with a nice smooth reading. The problem with a lot of cars is the electrical system is noisy. So when you have dynamos and control boxes and all sorts of things, there's a lot of electrical noise in the system. And a lot of modern equipment that's digital doesn't necessarily have the electrical shielding or smoothing in the circuitry to enable you to use that. The good thing about the Innova timing light is this has been designed for that, so that does have that, but this is, you know, rarer. Okay, so my advice to you is if you need a timing light, buy one of those. But if you're in the market for an old school tune-up meter, then you won't go far wrong with a Heath kit, but you will have to do some work to it. Okay, so number 3 on my list, fixed or variable dwell. So I've already mentioned it during this video, but I think what we'll talk about now is what dwell angle is in terms of fixed or variable. So a points system is fixed dwell. You know, you set the points gap, as we've already mentioned, and it will deliver a certain dwell angle. And as you rev the engine, there'll be some minor changes, but it's effectively fixed at the RPM, at the same RPM all the way up the rev range. As I say, there are some slight changes, but we won't worry about that. A variable dwell system is a system that you find on modern electronic ignition systems like the Power Spark distributors that I use, the Lucas 65D from the later Minis and Metros has a variable dwell system. And what this basically means is it does exactly the same thing as a ballast resistor, but it does it electronically. So you don't use a ballast resistor with a variable dwell dizzy. What happens is the dwell angle is reduced right down at low RPM, so the coil isn't oversaturated, and it keeps the current down, doesn't overheat. And then as the RPM rises, the dwell angle, the coil charge time, increases. So by the time you're at 6,000 RPM, you've got the full power and charge time applied to the coil. So no ballast resistor, full battery voltage, and then a wide dwell angle to make sure that coil has got plenty of energy flowing through it. So that is exactly what you need on a modern system, so you can fire a high power coil. So a lot of people go out and they fit a modern electronic ignition system with a 3 ohm coil. And the problem with that is you haven't got enough coil energy, and then you reduce the coil charge time at slow speed. So when you try starting the car, it's very hard to start. So it cranks a lot before it fires. The engine might have misfires. You'll find it's very, it doesn't like running on lean mixtures, all that sort of stuff. So the important thing to understand is when you fit your ignition system, if you have a dwell meter, you'll understand, you can work out whether it's what type of ignition it is, whether it's fixed or variable dwell. So a lot of the time people see me using my dwell meter. I'm just using it on an electronic system to work out what type of system it is, so then I can understand what coil resistance it needs and whether it needs a ballast resistor or not. So that's why I do it. Okay, so moving on to number 2, spark plug type. Okay, so now we get to the spark plugs. So I think you can all guess what number 1 might be, but number 2 is spark plug type. And what I mean by that is people are fitting typically the wrong heat ranges or the wrong type of plug altogether. So as I've mentioned before in the video I did on spark plugs a little while ago now, the heat range is important. So a lot of people I come out to, they fitted 6 or 7 NGK heat range plugs to a 998 or an 850, and then they wonder why it won't start, or it misfires, or it runs nice when they first put them in, and after a week it won't run properly, or it won't start, or whatever. Heat range. So typically you need the right heat range. watch that video for the particular heat ranges, but the and why. But typically, a small bore application standard, you want 5 heat range in NGK plugs. For a 1275 based engine, you want 6s, and for a tuned 1275, you want to start thinking about 7s. Race engines can use 8s as well, so it's something to bear in mind, but people get it wrong, as they do with resistors. So resistor plugs, that adds about 4 to 5k resistance, as I've already mentioned. If you've got if you want a low resistance ignition system, then you don't want to be using resistor plugs. Some engines, like those used factory fuel injection, you need a resistor plug to stop the interference affecting the ECU. But for the classic cars that just have a basic ignition system, whether that's points or electronic, I always use a non-resistor plug with a resistor lead. Okay, so as I said, I've already covered resistance I like, so let's move on. And number one, I'm sure you can all guess what that is. Number one on my list is, of course, wrong spark plug gap. That's still the top of the list because it's on virtually every single engine I come to. People take the spark plugs out of the pack, put them in. They're not gapping them. Do not do it. It is affecting the performance. It is affecting the drivability of your engine. It's affecting the way the engine starts. It affects a massive amount of stuff. It can even cause premature coil failure because a wider gap means higher resistance to fire the plug. So therefore the coil voltage has to go up. Okay, so yes, this is a real thing because I've had to solve the problem. Gap your plugs properly. So typically 3 ohm coil, you want to be using 25 thou spark plug gap as a starting point. 1.5 ohm coil, you want to be using a 25 thou spark plug gap. When you get to the 0.8 ohm coil, then you can go up to 35 thou, but that's the only situation. So hopefully you found this video useful. The idea of doing this was following on from the SU one, was to give you an idea of the sort of things I come across and to make it easier for you to perhaps get your cars ready when I'm coming round to tune your car, or just basically live with your car and make a better job of maintaining it yourself. So as ever, if you like this content, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Thank you very much.